Hi, I'm Anna Hoffman, and I'm a data and applied scientist slash program manager on the Azure data team. And today I'm joined by Ajay.
Hi, Anna. Thanks for the invitation. I'm a group program manager in the Azure SQL team. Our engineering team is responsible for building and managing the various options of SQL that we are going to talk about today, as well as helping customers leverage the platform successfully for their business applications. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Ajay. Now, our session today is called Azure SQL, What to Use When and What's New. So we're really excited because we're not only going to share what we think our best practice guidance is for choosing a deployment option and service tier in Azure SQL, but we're also going to share some of the latest enhancements, innovations, and tips and tricks that you can hopefully use going forward. Now, a few housekeeping items related to PaaS. Please explore all the things that PaaS has to offer. We have things all throughout the year, so there's plenty of content, especially in this virtual world, to stay connected to the community. And you can find all that at paas.org. And we also ask that after this session, you fill out the session evaluation. This helps Ajay and myself understand what we can do better, what you want to learn more about, and what PaaS should consider in the future. So please do that. And with that, I'm going to explain our agenda. So like I already kind of mentioned, we're going to talk about the different offerings. We're going to talk about what to use when, and then we're going to talk about what's new. So with that, I will start by explaining the general Azure SQL offering. So the first deployment option is SQL Server on an Azure virtual machine. And that's really what it sounds like. It's just SQL Server running on an Azure virtual machine. So this means you get to pick the SQL Server version, the OS version, and we do some things to help you, but it also means, you're going to have to manage things like upgrades. Now, that's our IaaS service, our infrastructure as a service. Then we have two services in our platform as a service, or PaaS offering. And these services are evergreen services, meaning you don't have to upgrade again. And we take care of a lot of things for you to reduce that management scope that you need. Now, over the following few slides, we're going to dive into the differences between both Azure SQL Managed Instance and Azure SQL Database as PaaS services, as well as differences with IaaS or SQL Server in an Azure virtual machine. So with that, I will pass it over to Ajay to talk to us a little bit more about the value prop for Azure SQL, whether it's IaaS or PaaS.
Thanks, Anna. Yeah, so whether you're running a SQL Server on premises, edge, on a different cloud, or even on Azure, one of the beauties is it's built on the same core SQL Server engine code base, which means you get the same familiar surface area for your applications, which you can run through T-SQL or various APIs. You can use all your existing tools such as SSMS, Azure Data Studio, Visual Studio, etc., and across any development environment, whether it's Windows, Mac, Linux, containers, and then choose a deployment of your choice based on your application needs. Now, one of the things that really drives the value for Azure SQL is price performance, which is what customers care about end of day. So we had GigaOM, one of the third-party analyst firms, who ran a price performance benchmark comparison with TPC-like workload, which is transaction-heavy workload. And as you can see the chart on the left, with our PaaS offerings, you have significant savings up to 86% with reserved instance and other benefits such as Azure Hybrid Benefit or other competitive clouds like AWS. Likewise, even if you decide to go to IaaS, you can still realize significant cost savings because you can move your existing licenses using Azure Hybrid Benefits, reserved instances, and gain similar savings. What this really means is SQL runs best on Azure compared to any other clouds. So now, moving on, we'll talk about what to use when, or I will hand it over to Anna.
Thanks, Ajay. Yeah, I think that really helps, and the price performance really kind of brings home why, at the end of the day, you might want to land on one of our deployment offerings. Now, what we're going to do next is for each deployment option, we're going to take you through some customer challenges, and then as well as the solution that Azure SQL provides, and kind of why we think it's best on Azure. So I'll pass it to Ajay to talk about SQL on VMs.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. So SQL on VMs. So this is your good old SQL Server, 25 plus years in the market that you're used to running in your own data center or other hosted environments. Now, a lot of customers want to move this environment to cloud. So there are a few different scenarios why they would pick VMs. Here, the customer challenges for example, my infrastructure or data center contract is expiring. I have really old versions of SQL Server and applications built on those versions, which I really cannot modernize or upgrade at this time. And I also need to have complete control over my environment, everything from the OS level to SQL Server version, as well as control the entire patching and upgrade experience, the backup story, as well as high availability and disaster recovery. And finally, if you want to run other features outside of SQL Server, whether it's applications or business intelligence services such as SSRS, AS, etc. SQL Server on Azure VMs gets you this complete flexibility and control. And in addition to that, what Azure differentiates is we give you free extended security updates if you're bringing existing SQL 2008 or R2 environments, which are end of support. You get the security updates for free, so you can rest assured that you can continue to run those old applications till you have the time to modernize and upgrade. Plus, we will also talk about some additional benefits we are enabling in the service to improve the manageability experience of the service. So one such customer who ran successfully in this topology is Allscripts. It's a famous healthcare software solution provider used by several hospitals around the country. And they were successful in moving and realizing cost savings by shifting several applications that were built on SQL Server environment and without significant or any code changes. You can see more about their case study in the link provided in the notes section, as well as look at the economic impact to understand how they realize these savings. Now, moving on to the next slide, how do we realize additional benefits for VMs in Azure only? So we recently released what's called the SQL IaaS extension for virtual machines. So this is a unique set of agents that are running just for your Azure virtual machines running SQL Server to give you multiple benefits, which are listed in this slide. At a high level, it gives you flexibility to manage your costs through license type choice. So you can either pick pay as you go or bring your own license. You can do in-place edition updates from, let's say, standard edition to enterprise edition or downgraded. You can sign up for automatic security updates and patching, as well as integrate with other security centers services such as Azure Key Vault. Finally, on the manageability side, we have added support for automatic backups, HADR templates, as well as we introduced free DR and HA replicas for each VM. That literally gives you 3 for the price of 1 primary replica. And all in all, it gives you a centralized managed experience in the portal where you can manage all your single virtual machines from a central management portal. So now, how do you get this agent? And what are the different ways to register it? So if we look at the next slide, you can see all the capabilities that are available depending on what mode you're running the VM in. So out of the box, without any agent, you can see the first column. It's pretty much everything is under your own control that you have to set up and manage using your scripts or other tools. However, if you register the VM in lightweight mode, we do provide some basic manageability things like license choice as well as unified view. But to realize the full benefit of license cost as well as manageability, we highly recommend customers to register in full mode because this gives you all the automatic capabilities that we talked about in the previous slide. Now, if in the next slide, you can see here's a recent update we have made available both in the portal, the screenshot at the bottom, as well as through command line, where you can automate and simplify the registration of all your VMs at a subscription level without having to go individual VM per basis. So if you go to the Azure portal and click on SQL Server VM registration, all it asks you is for consent. And if you accept the consent, we will go ahead and automatically install and register it for you. And Most importantly, as it calls out at the bottom, this data will not be used for any audit. So Microsoft will only use this to help you manage your environments better. And if you want to do this automatic across your entire tenant mini subscriptions, you can also use the command line interface to set it up, so you don't have to go to the portal to do this experience.
Awesome. Thanks, Ajay. This is really cool. And I like how we're making it easier. I think that's like a consistent theme across Azure SQL. It's just we're always working to make things easier for customers. The next service we're going to talk about moves into the platform as a service tier, and this is Azure SQL Managed Instance. Now, reasons that customers tend to land in Azure SQL Managed Instance are that they want to move to Azure. They want to move to a more managed service. So they want to move out of something like SQL Server and Azure VM into something like Azure SQL Managed Instance, which provides an SLA and a lot of ease of access of doing things that we take care of for you. Now, one thing that they need that makes them land here as opposed to Azure SQL Database is they really want those instance scoped features. And when we talk about instance scoped features, we're talking about CLR, Service Broker, SQL Server Agent, now recently DTC and machine learning services. These features are scoped to the instance, so they're only available in Azure SQL Managed Instance today as opposed to Azure SQL Database. So that's a big reason that we see people moving towards Azure SQL Managed Instance. And, sometimes you'll hear folks say, you get the best of SQL Server with the best of a managed service because you're also moving to this versionless SQL, so you never have to worry about an upgrade again. We have things that can help you with native virtual network support because we deploy basically a whole virtual cluster that's dedicated to you. We have the vast SQL Server surface area covered. We have some other things that make it easier for you to move from your on-prem environment to a managed service. And you can see some of these stats related to our projected return. And Ajay also mentioned some of the price performance studies. Now, a customer I really like that moved to managed instance is Komatsu. And I like this customer story because they were able to move a pretty sizable database, about 1.5 terabytes, smoothly to Azure SQL Managed Instance with very few code changes. And, they self-reported these numbers to us, and they were able to see a 49% reduction in cost, which is pretty significant, as well as some pretty sizable performance gains, 25 to 30%. So this is just another example of a customer that's moved to Azure and seen, great success as well as cost reduction. Now, if we switch gears and talk about our other platform as a service, which is Azure SQL Database, this is really meant for, modern cloud applications. So customers might move to managed instance and they still want to manage a SQL Server and see these SQL Server instance scope features, where many folks moving to Azure SQL Database don't want to have to worry about any of that. They want to move straight into a database and start to harness some of the power that Azure has. And a lot of the innovation that we'll talk about throughout the rest of this session does land in Azure SQL Database. Now, when we talk about customer challenges, there are a few things that could lead a customer to Azure SQL Database. One big thing is if they are looking for a multi-tenanted type of service, we offer elastic pools, which is really great for that type of scenario. Also, if a customer has unpredictable or sporadic type of workloads, we'll talk in depth about serverless, which is currently only today available in Azure SQL Database, as well as customers with really large databases that aren't really looking to move into a SQL data warehousing situation. We have Azure SQL Database Hyperscale, which we'll also talk a little bit about, and there are sessions we definitely recommend you checking out throughout the conference. Now, if we talk about other reasons why you might move towards Azure SQL Database, we have the industry highest SLA at 99.995% availability. This means we're guaranteeing your uptime to be less than 26 minutes per year, which is a pretty big number. And again, mentioning those price performance studies, we definitely recommend you check these out and even try for yourself to see the type of performance gains you can receive with Azure SQL Database. Now, one customer I like to talk about related to this is AccuWeather, and I like to talk about them because they were really looking to harness the power of the cloud. So not only did they want to start building new applications with Azure SQL Database, but they wanted to very easily connect them to other services like Azure Machine Learning Services and Azure Data Factory and use these things to build intelligent applications while also leveraging some of the intelligent capabilities that land in Azure SQL Database. Now, Ajay, we've kind of talked about these different solutions. Can you kind of walk me through, at the end of the day, how I should think about making this decision?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is a really good question. A lot of customers are asking. You heard about all the deployment choices and different customers successfully running on the cloud. So one of the things we really see customers workload patterns is they're bringing existing apps assets as a migration scenario, or they are taking existing apps and modernizing in the cloud to leverage some of the new cloud services, such as machine learning, cognitive services, etc. Or they're building ground up on completely in the cloud as greenfield applications. So no matter any of these applications that you pick, you always start with two basic questions, right? What level of control do I need for my environment? And second, what capabilities do I really need for my business application? So if you're able to answer these two fundamental questions, it'll help you easily in your decision making. So now let's look at control. So there are two choices here. The first one is customer managed. Here we are talking about an environment where the customer wants full control. As we discussed earlier, you want the entire environment under your manageability control. You want all the capabilities of SQL Server and the operating system with the option to pick the specific version of the OS as well as specific version of SQL and manage your own patching and upgrade schedule, set up your HADR story, backup strategy, etc. Plus also leverage all the other capabilities outside of SQL Server database engine, such as BI and other services and applications running in that environment. Then your decision is pretty straightforward. You would just go to SQL Server on Azure VMs, as we discussed earlier. Now, the second question comes, this is a lot of operational work for me. I want to really leverage the benefits of cloud, like Anna talked about, best of SQL with best of cloud. Then you can leave it to Microsoft to manage your environment. So then you become a fully managed service. Here, the decision becomes then is what level of capabilities does your application need? If your application is built on such an architecture where it requires instance level features of SQL Server engine, some of which are listed here, such as cross-database transactions, CLR, SQL agent, link servers, etc., then you would pick managed instance. If you just need a database as a service where you don't need instance level features, but you're just using a database scope application programming model, then you would pick SQL database. So on the PaaS side, even though both instance as a service and database as a service have differences in the surface area, they are built on the same Azure service fabric, meaning you get all the built-in benefits of evergreen version of SQL, which is fully managed and maintained by Microsoft, upgrades, patching of the whole stack from the SQL down to the host OS, as well as built-in high availability and all the SLAs that Anna shared. So these are the different choices, and then you can dial up and down between different tiers, such as general purpose, hyperscale, business critical, as well as pick different storage and compute sizes depending on your workload requirements. So this is high-level guidance, and then we will later talk about some tools we are making available to help customers simplify their decision making. Thank you, Anna.
Thanks, Ajay. We're going to try something new. This is strange that we're virtual and we're at home. So what we're going to try is doing a knowledge check. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read two scenarios. And what I want you all to do watching is to use the discussion chat to put your answers in. So for example, if you think the answer to both questions is D, just put D as one entry and go ahead and put that in the chat. So I'm going to read the scenarios and then we'll give you guys some time. So the first scenario is you want to migrate to the cloud, but you leverage a third-party application which requires access to the OS. Which Azure SQL deployment option will be the easiest to move to? So that's scenario one. Scenario two is you want to migrate to the cloud and remove some of the management associated with SQL Server, but your application leverages CLR and service broker capabilities from SQL Server. which Azure SQL deployment will be the easiest to move to? Now, be careful with that second question because there might be two answers, but if you read carefully, there is one clear answer. So now I'll give you a few seconds to think about your answer and put it in the chat window. All right, so hopefully you were able to answer, and we'll monitor the chat. But Ajay, do you want to take a stab at this first question, where the user needs access to the OS?
Yeah, I mean, that was a clear giveaway to the answer. As we can see from all the options listed below A through D, and we discussed in the previous slides, the first answer A, SQL Server in Azure Virtual Machine, is the only option which gives you the underlying OS action. And as the key differentiator is all the other deployment options, whether it's instance or the database, are all fully managed environments by Microsoft. So you only have access to the SQL instance or the surface area for the applications.
Awesome. Thanks, Ajay. Okay, now what about the second one? I think it was a little trickier. What do you think?
Yeah, it was tricky. I think there are more than one answers, but there's a very nuanced statement there in the question which can help decide the answer. So let's break it down. As you can see in the question, the application needs CLR and service broker capabilities. So we can clearly rule out C and D because CLR is not supported in the single database option. So that leaves us with A and B. So both A and B can be used for CLR and service broker. But if you go up to the beginning part of the sentence, read the part where it says remove some of the management associated. So Anna shared the information that the PaaS offerings gives best managed experience for SQL as well as the best SQL Server engine surface area. So in that case, Azure SQL Managed Instance is a clear choice because we fully manage the environment, but yet we give you the near 100% compatibility with your SQL Server engine.
Awesome. Thanks, Ajay. I really like your explanations. I think this is a great segue to just take a brief look. This isn't a formal demo by any means, but let me go ahead and show you. So what we have here is the Azure Portal, and what we're trying to do is make this decision easier for you. So one, if you go into the Azure Portal and you just select Azure SQL, if you don't have that blade up there, you can just search for Azure SQL, get to the same place. But what you can see here, and I'll just narrow down my subs, but what you can see here is all of my Azure SQL resources, as well as the service tiers, which we're going to dive into soon. But you can see my SQL databases, my managed instances, my logical servers, even my SQL virtual machines, all in one place. So this is really great about Azure SQL. And even better, we're making it easier when you go to deploy and you're trying to make this decision. We actually have use cases associated with single database or SQL managed instance, as well as, and I think this is really puts the icing on the cake, is SQL virtual machines. You can actually search for the exact OS and SQL Server version that you need. And this even includes Ubuntu and SUSE SLES and RHEL, and all the way back to SQL Server 2008 R2 SP3. So really, you have all your options here that we're really trying to make it easy for you to make a decision about where you should land. So that's just a quick demo to kind of show you this Azure SQL unified experience that we're working towards. So next, what we're going to do is we're going to dive into things like purchasing models and service tiers, because these are also very important decisions as you go towards selecting what to use when.
Yeah, so as we see, I mean, once you pick the first level of service, whether it's database managed instance or VM, the next decision is how do you pick next layer of deployment choices. So for SQL database, we have two choices. One is the DTU model and the other one is the vCore model. The DTU model has been there since the inception of the service for more than a decade, and the vCore was introduced a couple of years back. So the main difference is DTU model is a pre-packaged model, so where you don't have to worry about a specific number of compute, storage, memory requirements. You just pick a DTU tier, and then we completely bundled offer, and then you get a specific amount of transaction throughput for the DTU that you pick. And once you pick the DTU model, inside that there are different options like basic, standard, and premium. The main differences there will differentiate the amount of availability and performance SLAs, where premium gives you higher level of SLAs because we automatically give you multiple built-in availability replicas and automatically manage the HA in those scenarios. Whereas in the standard environment, uh, we uh, we only have redundancy at the storage layer. For the compute, we'll automatically start a new compute if there's a failure. And if you are really looking for high transactional throughput workloads, then premium is where you go. So that's the main thing. On the vCore model, which was introduced a couple of years back, and it's available for both the database as well as managed instance and other options like serverless and hyperscale. Here you get more flexibility in terms of compute and storage choices because you can independently scale your compute and storage from 2 vCores all the way to 80 vCores. And then you can also leverage, if you're bringing your existing licenses, you can leverage Azure Hybrid Benefit in exchange for these vCores to gain additional cost savings and also apply reserved capacity for getting even more cost savings, up to 86% compared to other clouds like we discussed earlier. So here again, you have 3 choices once you pick vCore. General purpose, which is similar to standard tier, and then business critical, and then hyperscale. Let's take a comparison of the workloads when you would pick each service tier. Anna, do you want to talk about general purpose and business critical first?
Sure. Thanks, Ajay. So as Ajay mentioned, if you dive into the vCore model for both Azure SQL Database and Managed Instance, there are 2 options available. The first is general purpose, and as it kind of suggests in the name, this is meant for most business workloads. So this is where we see many of our customers landing, and they're doing just fine. Now, we also have the business critical service tier, which also kind of like the name suggests, is really meant for your workloads that require super low latency and really fast failover times. Now, if I try to compare general purpose with business critical, there are a few big things that kind of stand out. Now, underneath, when you think about general purpose, you can kind of think of it like a failover cluster instance. So you really just have that primary compute with your data and log files on Azure Premium Storage and your backups in Azure Standard Storage, and you can kind of configure what the redundancy is for that. Now, when you look at business critical, what we actually do is we deploy similar to an always-on availability group behind the scenes. So you have 3 secondary replicas at any given time, and one of those you can use as a read-only endpoint. So this can kind of give you a little bit of read scale. You can also imagine, because you already have secondary replicas that exist, the failover time is much faster, and you can get more I/O per second out of a business critical service tier. But there is, a price comparison between business critical. It is more expensive than the general purpose service tier. And there's one more service tier which is available only in Azure SQL Database today.
Yeah, so let me talk about hyperscale. I mean, as the name implies, it really is hyper, and it provides limitless scale. And one of the reasons is to leverage the benefits of cloud. And unlike other tiers, customers are really looking for an elastic environment where they can future-proof their investments, right? They can stall. If you're starting with a small application, and let's say you're a startup and you don't know how it'll grow, you could start with a very small deployment choice under hyperscale. But then as your business workloads grow and your application grows, so does the service. It can automatically scale up to 100 terabytes of storage and also multiple read replicas, yet give you the highest performance in terms of IOPS as well as read scale. Plus, it gives you the cost savings with all the benefits we discussed. So hyperscale is a deployment choice if you're really looking for that kind of scenario.
Thanks, Ajay. Now, we wanted to take some time to kind of dive into 2 of our newer scenarios, which we're seeing a lot of growth and adoption from our customers. And the first is serverless. Now let's imagine a scenario. So let's say I work for a company and we have a line of business expense reporting application. Now this application doesn't get used a ton on a regular basis. It does, however, see, like pretty big workloads that come at the end of the month where everyone's trying to get their expense reports in on time. Additionally, this application is only used kind of during business hours. No one's really doing expense reports late at night or on the weekends. So this is what we would say is not only unpredictable because you don't know what workload is going to hit the application, but also sporadic because it's only used during the work days and not even every day. So this is a great use case or an example for Azure SQL Database Serverless, because what we can do is you can set the minimum and the maximum number of vCores, and we can actually scale you between that on a per second basis and bill you accordingly. Now, when everyone starts to go home and no one's filing expense reports anymore, after a certain inactivity period, you can actually set Azure SQL Database to auto pause. So let's say you set it to auto pause after 1 or 2 hours, and after no one hits the database for that time, it actually, SQL Server essentially shuts down and we separate the compute from the storage. So during this pause time, you're only paying for the storage. Now, the next morning, when somebody hits that database, initially it will fail as this, we reconnect and get it start up again. But very shortly after that, you'll be back up to your minimum vCore, and then you'll be able to, again, scale on a per second basis. Now, one thing to caution is that you will start up back with a cold cache. So again, you have to make sure that this is the right scenario for you, but we are seeing huge adoption in this space. And we thought it would be kind of cool to show you an example of serverless in action. All right, so here I have a serverless database with a range I set between 0.5 vCores and 8 vCores. You can see that currently only 1 vCore is being used, but the other 7 are available. Now I'm going to use OStress to simulate an unpredictable workload that has a spike in demand. Now, what you'll be able to see if I run this query again is how serverless is going to be able to auto scale up to the number of vCores that are needed for that workload. And in turn, I'm only going to be billed on a per second basis for what my workload actually needs. And that's what I can see in the total CPU seconds. Now, we've also implemented a fascinating cache reclamation architecture that can help bring you back down to your minimum vCores that you set up once the heavy workload completes. So that's an unpredictable workload, but let's say the application using this database is also intermittent. After business hours, no one touches this database. For this, I can take advantage of the pausing capability, and in this case, I set the auto pause delay to 1 hour of inactivity. So during this pause time, SQL Server is essentially shut down since the compute is separated from the storage, and I'm only going to have to pay for the storage. In my app CPU build history, you can see that I'm only being billed for the CPU I actually use. Even if I take a look at the past 24 hours, you can see spikes where my compute utilization was up, and then how the cache was reclaimed and we went back to being paused. So that's serverless, which is great for intermittent and or unpredictable workloads. So that's just one demo related to serverless. And I think the next thing we want to do is kind of do a little bit deeper dive into Hyperscale. Ajay, can you help us with that?
Yeah, I mean, the diagram is looking a little bit busy and complex. Let me break it down. It's actually much simpler. So one of the key takeaways here is separation of compute and storage. As I mentioned earlier, Hyperscale gives you that flexibility where you can independently scale compute and storage, either scale up or scale out, and we'll see how that happens. And on the top layer, as you can see, the compute layer, this is where all the user queries run. So it can be either on the primary compute, which accepts both read and write workloads, or on the secondary compute, where you can have up to 4 replicas and you can run your read workloads, which can be scaled out. What is backing all these queries is multiple layers of caching. So all the blue rectangles that you see, which says RBPEX data cache, provides multiple layers of caching. So there's cache in the primary compute layer, and then there's a fully backed page server cache, which fully covers your database size. So for example, if you have a 10 terabyte database, you will have a 10 terabyte size page servers, and then your actual databases reside on remote data storage. What this really means is when you are running a query, like let's say a read query, it'll either be in your primary compute's cache or be in a page server's cache. So you don't have to go to actual disk to get the data. Or if you are writing a data, what happens is it gets flushed to the primary compute's cache, and as well as it is persisted by the log cache into the landing zone, and from there to long-term storage. Plus, the log service is also responsible for flushing the same changes to the page servers, as well as feeding it to all the secondary computes. So one interesting artifact that you see here is no matter how many replicas you have, they all share the same database. So you don't have to have multiple copies of database for each replica. So you can do really near real-time analytics on your secondary compute layer. Plus innovations such as accelerated database recovery, which power the engine behind the Hyperscale, helps you recover databases faster. In cases there's a failover or restart of the compute, the database can come online very quickly. Also, when you are doing expensive operations like backups and restores, they happen on the remote data store on the page servers. So it's completely offloaded from the compute tier, so minimizing impact for the user applications. So some of these innovations is what powers the hyperscale. And from an application or a customer perspective, the only thing they will be touching is the compute layer, and everything underneath is taken care automatically by the managed service. So with that, I will hand it back to Anna to quickly show hyperscale in action.
Awesome. Thanks, Ajay. Let's take a look at how Hyperscale enables you to achieve greater read scale. So here in my virtual machine, what I have is a write workload on a Hyperscale database on the left, and a read workload, which I haven't run yet, from SQL Query Stress, which is going to hit the same endpoint on the right on that Hyperscale database. Now what you're going to see is when I start the read workload on the primary endpoint, you're going to see the number of events per second I'm able to process takes a hit while this workload runs, because it's kind of sharing the same capacity. Now with Hyperscale, what I can do is add up to 4 readable replicas, which you can see I've gone ahead and done this now. So if I come back to SQL Query Stress, what I've done is I set up 4 identical windows to the first, except what you can see in the database connection details is that I'm leveraging the application intent of read only on each of these connections. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to close the workload hitting the right endpoint, and I'm going to kick off this workload on the 4 readable endpoints that I have set up. Now what you're going to see is there's minimal impact on my primary write workload, which is going to allow me to increase my write workload while at the same time quadrupling my read workload.
Thanks, Anna. That's really cool. So here are some customers that are leveraging Azure SQL deployment options, and you can see that HR block is running managed instance. The reason they picked managed instance is because of the instance level features they were using for their tax application, and they wanted to have an easy migration path to the cloud without having to make significant changes. So they were able to leverage managed instance, and also once they moved to the cloud, it opened the door for them to leverage other Azure services in the ecosystem, such as machine learning capabilities. Now, if you look at ClearSale, they are actually a retail e-commerce fraud detection application service. They are running a huge data center on premises, and they're increasing costs of managing the environment, and data growth means it became very expensive both operationally and capital-wise. So they clearly sought for a deployment choice, which gave them the flexibility to grow currently as well as in the future. So Hyperscale met their needs significantly, improving their performance as well as saving their costs. and they're running successfully on that platform. And finally, Cambrain, it's an event management company. It's for booking events, and since this is a very intermittently used application and workload, they were looking for significant cost-saving options, and also their workload was unpredictable depending on season, so they wanted a way to elastically scale up and down depending on incoming customer workload patterns. So serverless was a great fit for this customer. So after moving to serverless, they don't have to worry about auto scale, and also with per second billing, they're only paying for when the service is being used. So significant benefits for this customer, and they're running successfully on Azure SQL Serverless.
Awesome. Cool. These are great, like real world examples that also help, hopefully help our viewers figure out what to use when given a scenario. Now we're going to try another knowledge check. This is the last one. So what we're going to do is, again, I'll read the scenarios. We'll give you some time to answer. And then please put the answer to both of those questions into the chat whenever you have your answer. You don't have to wait to send them. So the first scenario is you're moving an application and a database to Azure, but your database is currently 62 terabytes in size and plans to continue to grow. You don't currently leverage any instance scope features, which Azure SQL deployment option will be the easiest for you to move to. And then the second question is, or scenario is, you have an Azure SQL database with the serverless compute to your database deployed with an auto pause delay of 2 hours. After 2 hours of no activity, what happens to your databases and the incurred charges? So now I'm going to give you guys a second to go ahead and answer that question. All right, so hopefully you were able to answer the questions with no problems. Ajay, do you want to help us answer, where should this 62 terabyte database land?
Yeah, so again, looking at the question closely, and if you paid attention to some of the key differences between our deployment choices, at your first look, you might think that you may have more than one option. So let's look at it. So SQL Server and virtual machine definitely supports as much storage as you can have in the virtual machine. Managed instance currently does not support more than 8 terabytes for general purpose or 4 terabytes, so we can rule that out. So C and D are interesting. So Elastic Pools also doesn't support more than 4 terabytes today. And now that leaves with single database. So as you heard recently, Hyperscale is a deployment choice, which is a single database option, and that can go up to 100 terabytes. So now you can pick either A or C, but considering that you don't need any instance scope features, which is listed as a requirement, you can easily move it to Hyperscale, because that way you don't have to worry about management of the environment as well as end of support. So I would pick C for the first question.
Awesome.
Now,
thanks, Ajay.
yeah.
And for this, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so second question, again, serverless. One of the things Anna mentioned is it provides industry-leading granular billing. And when your service is paused, we don't bill you for the compute, only for the storage. So which means you have the answer is here is A.
Awesome. Thanks, Ajay. Now moving forward, we are going to talk about some recent updates.
Yeah, so there's a lot of content in the next couple of slides. So I will touch on the high-level themes. So whatever you see in blue are recent updates in the last 6 months or so, and whatever you see in white text are new updates in the last 1 month or so. And if you want to keep up with all the updates in the cloud world, we are continuously releasing features, as you can see. Subscribe to the RSS feed. The link is provided on the top under the Azure Updates link. So now let's look at managed instance. One of the primary goals of managed instance to be able to help customers moving SQL Server workloads from on-prem to cloud with minimal friction and increase the surface area. So under the past app compatibility, you can see we added capabilities like AAD logins and trace flags, and most recently we announced support for distributed transaction and ML services, as well as reporting services. So if you're leveraging any of these features in your application, now it makes it easier for you to move to managed instance. Network and connectivity is an area where we get continuous feedback to improve the story and footprint. So we have recently announced features like service endpoints, subnet delegation, also most recently global VNet peering. So if your managed instances are in different Azure regions, you no longer have to set up site-to-site connection. You can just do VNet peering and set it up, as well as bring your own keys with TDE and TLS requirements. And finally, we have enabled data discovery and classification for classifying your highly confidential data. On the PaaS side, we continue to evolve the various features such as failover groups, bring your own keys. I talked about Azure Accelerated Database Recovery. Azure Active Directory integration is becoming a very important requirement. One more thing that customers ask us is giving us more transparency in failover, in creating the instance, and also any sizing operations. In the past, the experience was instance creation takes a while, or even if you resize it, it takes a while. Now we have a dashboard which shows full progress of which step the operation is through in the portal that you can see, or even through programmatically through various APIs. And we also enabled either through REST API, PowerShell, or command line, ability to test application resiliency by initiating your own HA failovers. Remember, we talked about built-in HA. So you want to see, if you want to do HA drills and you want to test how your application behaves, you can initiate now with various programmatic options. And last but not least, very important, customers in some countries which have data residency requirements wanted specific zone redundant configuration options for their backups. So they have that option now, plus with additional compression options and local and geo-redundant storage choices, you can get additional savings for your backups. Last but not least, performance is an area we continue to invest. So recently, with latest update, we have significantly improved TempDB performance as well as your data and log performance. I will let me share quickly a little more on what that is in the next slide. As you can see here, the throughput was limited based on number of files you were using, as well as the database size, because Azure storage throttles your throughput. So now we have significantly increased your per DB limit as well as your instance max, as you can see, for both general purpose and business critical. And the big difference from here is the log rate has gone almost 5 times bigger. As you can see for different compute tiers, how the log generation rate on the chart on the right shows. And we ran TPC workloads to compare how the performance is. And you can see 2 to 4x throughput improvement depending on the type of tier and the workload. And also the ingestion rate has gone up by 2 to 3 times by just these significant improvements with no additional changes required from your application side. So now let's look at the next set of updates. For Hyperscale, we recently GA change tracking. So if you want to build applications to track changes from in your data lineage as it goes through its life cycle, it's available now. We also announced preview for GeoDR and database copy options, which were required by customers. And on the serverless, few things which we have done is increase the upper limit for your max vCore elasticity up to 40 vCores. We continue to improve the API experience for connection retries as well as connection resiliency. So look forward to further improvements in the serverless area. On the platform itself, we G8 private link, as you know, and added UTF-8 support. We also announced new M-series and F-series queues for SQL DB. So if you have compute optimized and memory optimized workloads, you can leverage that. We also now have, in addition to BC's tier, general purpose tier has zone redundancy. So you can meet the multi-availability zone requirement if your application needs that capability, as well as the backup storage redundancy, which I spoke about for MI, is also available for single database. On the virtual machine side, the agent extension is the big one. As I mentioned, all the past like benefits that you get with automated patching, security updates, as well as a free HADR and a DR replica. So you get 2 additional replicas for every primary replica that you have, 3 for the price of 1. If you're doing failover clustering, now you have Azure shared disk support. And finally, we have simplified the always-on deployment experience through a new portal blade.
Thanks, Ajay. It seems like, there's a lot of really cool things here. A few things that I think are really interesting are, one, for MI, the performance improvements you were talking about are super cool because they don't require any increase in cost either. You just woke up one morning and your MI was like 2 times as fast. And then also this always on availability groups to configure that in the portal is pretty cool because, setting up an always on availability group is not easy. And I feel like this gets you one step closer to the business critical tier we talked about, where we actually deploy that for you. Now, so we've talked about, what to use when, what's new, but we thought a really important part about Azure SQL is how are you going to get there? And so even though this isn't a migration session, we want to encourage you to attend some of our migration sessions. And we do want to share a little bit more about migration. So I'll pass that over to you, Ajay.
Yeah, thanks, Anaya. It is important on knowing how to get there. If you have a lot of applications that are running on SQL Server successfully today. So there are 2 different pathways that we see customers take today to Azure SQL. And it really depends on what your business objective is. So the first one is what we are seeing a trend is customers who are running their own infrastructure and are the migration motivation is whether the data center is expiring or they need to increase capacity, or they are in the middle of their hardware software refresh cycle coming up, and also end of support. So they're really looking for an option where they just want to move their entire estate to the cloud and not have to worry about any of the infrastructure management. So in this case, rehost is the right option for them, where you just have to lift and shift your workloads, optimize it in the cloud once you're there, and leverage all the cost savings that we talked about, like AHub and RI. And the second set of things is customers who are looking to modernize and migrate and modernize. So they want to leverage some of the cloud benefits to avoid keeping up with all the security updates or meeting the compliance requirements, or also not losing to their competition because they're lacking innovation. So they want to continuously innovate the applications as new features and capabilities get lit up in the cloud. So this sort of workloads are looking to either refactor, re-architect, or rebuild. And for them, it's basically gives them the best of cloud for their applications and helps them stay competitive in the market as well as future-proof their innovations. So these are the 2 main pathways we are seeing. So how do we get there? So what are the tools that we are making customers available? So if you look at the rehost scenario, you typically have, for a database application like SQL Server, you have like a 2 or 3 tier architecture with an app or web tier and a middle tier and then the data tier. So you can take your lift and shift experience and move the app and web to VMs, as well as SQL Server can be moved through server migration to Azure SQL VM. And we will cover more of this in the migration session. And these things could be hosted in any environment. If it's like a line of business app running on, let's say, a virtualized environment like VMware or Hyper-V, or in other clouds like AWS, just GCP, you can just take those VMs and move them as is to Azure and leverage all the benefits. The second set of workloads is refactor. And here we are looking at customers who want to move and leverage the past benefits. So whether you're using Azure Migrate or individual migration services, you can move your data tier to our PaaS options like database or managed instance, depending on the application service area, and move your web and app tier to app service, which is also a managed service. You can use either Azure Migrate or other app migration tools. So these are 2 simple ways, but we will deep dive more on the exact methodology and end-to-end migration with various migration tools. How does the migration journey actually start? It starts with discovery, which is where you go and discover your entire estate and all the assets, whether it's data, infra, file servers, operating systems, applications, etc. Once you have the inventory, then your next big step is to make an assessment to understand where do I need to go to, whether I need to go to IaaS or PaaS, what are the business benefits like cost savings, like TCO, how do I size, what size do I pick? All those decision points happen in the assessment step. And then migration is where the actual movement of your workloads happen, whether it's IaaS and PaaS. And this is an iterative process. And then when you're ready to cut over, you can basically flip the switch. And then once you cut over, all your workload is running in the cloud. And finally, you can leverage other cost management tools and intelligent insights available to optimize your workloads. So this is the entire migration workflow that we recommend customers take. And for the database tier, we have many tools that are available, as you can see here, depending on where you're starting your database from and where you want into. And for SQL specifically, we have your database migration assistant for assessments and database migration service for migrations. You can also leverage Azure Migrate for entire discovery and assessment experience. If you're coming from Oracle or other database platforms, you can leverage SQL Server Migration Assistant. And then your destination can be IaaS, PaaS for Azure SQL, or if you want to go to other Azure database options, that's also available. And more on that in the migration session. With that, I will hand it over back to Anna to share some final thoughts.
Thanks, Ajay. So, we really wanted to wrap up by talking about some key takeaways. Now, the few key takeaways I want to talk about are specifically related to our Azure SQL managed databases. So what I'm talking about there, hopefully is very familiar to you. I'm talking about Azure SQL Managed Instance and Azure SQL Database. Now, just to recap some of the highlights, with both of these services, you're going to get evergreen SQL. You're never going to have to upgrade again. Making sure you don't get broken as things progress and technology moves forward no longer is your responsibility, which is awesome. We talked about how you can get the industry highest SLA with only 26 minutes or less of downtime per year. I'm also doing an availability session with Elaine Dormel and Emily Lisa later in this conference, so definitely check that session out. We talked about some of the performance and security updates that we're adding and some of the benefits that you get from a price performance standpoint. We talked about how you can go through this app modernization and migration journey and how we're kind of there to help you out wherever it is that you are. And so sometimes that's just rehosting, whereas sometimes it can be more intensive like refactoring or re-architecting. We talked about serverless and hyperscale. Hopefully, you learned something about those and you might consider seeing those sessions that are dedicated to those products as well. And we talked about how you can get the best TCO, the best price performance with Azure SQL. Now, really what we've touched is just the tip of the iceberg. Like there's so much more to learn. So we've included a ton of resources here. Probably the most relevant resource to you right now is this bottom right resource, aka.ms/Microsoft@PaaS. What you can see there is all of the Microsoft sessions when they're happening and a link to them at PaaS Summit so you can learn more about the various Azure SQL topics we touched on today. We're going to go deep into other topics like hyperscale, serverless, high availability. There's lots of other topics as well for you to learn more about Azure SQL. And you should follow us on Twitter at Azure SQL and use the hashtag Azure SQL to stay up to date with what we are doing. And with that, we really just want to thank you for joining us today. And, Ajay, before we open it up for Q&A, do you have any closing thoughts?
Yeah, it was our pleasure to come and share the Azure SQL platform. As you can see, there are many choices for you depending on your workloads. And we also share tons of successful customers who are running on the platform and realizing the benefits. And as a SQL Server customer, this gives you the best platform. SQL Server runs best on Azure, as you saw. So with that, let's go to Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, folks.